I remember it so vividly as though it was yesterday. It was my first semester of rabbinical school, and I was sitting in synagogue one afternoon, listening with rapt attention to a dear friend and colleague give a sermon. And he was talking in his sermon about how many of us who think of ourselves or are often perceived as outsiders in our own communities, Jews of color or Jews with disabilities, to name only two groups, are truly, as he put it, hosts in our tradition, though we are often treated by our institutions and communal spaces as guests. And this really resonated with me very strongly because, as someone who's blind, I have often experienced that feeling of marginalization, a feeling like I was on the outside of a community that I so desperately wanted to be part of, but didn't necessarily know if there was room for me. There's a very famous midrash that is typically cited around the holiday of Shavuot that says that all Jews, past, present, and future, were together at Mount Sinai to receive the revelation of Torah collectively. And simultaneous to that, we have a teaching that says that we each received revelation in a way that we could understand it as individuals. This is where we get the idea of 70 faces of Torah, or put another way, that Torah has infinite interpretations because each of us as an individual understood revelation in our own distinct and unique way. And there's a Hasidic teaching that says that as individuals, we are each on our own path in life. Your path is not my path is not yours. But together, we all create a beautiful, diverse tapestry that is the Jewish people. So if all of our portions, if all of our halakim are not together, we do not get to reveal Torah in its fullness into the world. We live at a time in which we are privileged to receive so many new chidushim, or so many new interpretations of Torah, that have enriched the conversation immeasurably. And what I find particularly beautiful about that is that so many of those chidushim are coming from the margins, are coming from Jews like myself and so many others who have asked the question, if I believe in a Torah Emet, in a truthful Torah, and a Torah Chaim, a living and a life-giving Torah, but I don't see myself reflected in the text, am I truly a host? Is this a Torah that I too can take hold of? There's a really interesting idea that people with disabilities are somehow a new phenomenon. It's as though before the disability rights movement of the 1960s, or perhaps earlier, depending on who you ask, people with disabilities weren't really here. Except that that's not actually the case, right? People with disabilities have existed as long as human beings have existed because disability is a natural part of the human experience. And people with disabilities are going to continue to exist far into the future. And in every generation, we accumulate and accrue knowledge that not only enriches us as individual people, but enriches the whole. But too often, that knowledge which we gain from our own individual lived experience of disability or what other difference one may have is not welcome or valued as culturally significant or religiously significant. And this is where I think we need to really rethink the paradigms that we use around inclusion. We tend to think of inclusion as a very transactional, top-down kind of model. You get the accommodation you need, and that's all we need to do. The work's done. But what if instead we mind our tradition for stories and individuals who really challenge that and perhaps give us a different pathway forward? One of my favorite places to be as a Jew is a Beit Midrash, or a house of study. And as a rabbinical student, I've spent quite a lot of time in the Beit Midrash. Last 4 years, day in and day out, I'm in the Beit Midrash and I'm learning Torah. And one of the joys of that, right, is being surrounded by the din of learning. I've got, for example, on any given day, I'll be sitting learning and I'll hear one chavruta pair, one study pair exclaim in frustration, I have been working on this sugya, on this passage of text for hours. Am I ever going to learn this? Oh, and why am I working through a language I don't speak anyway? And then on the other side, I've got a chavruta that's saying, finally, I cracked the code. And it's kind of like an orchestra, right? You've got multiple instruments, and you've got multiple people playing different parts. And those parts are simultaneously harmonious, discordant, but also really cacophonous, which makes a really unique sound quality. But I often find myself sitting in a Beit Midrash, thinking to myself, I'm playing an instrument, but I don't hear it back, and that's really strange. And that was the voice or the call of the one who is asking herself, I love this tradition, and I'm studying this tradition, and I'm dedicating my life to this, but I'm not seeing myself reflected. Is there room for me here? And after an incredible amount of study and seeking and exploration, I have come to the conclusion that the answer is a resounding yes. Jews with disabilities, just like many other communities, have to root ourselves, I believe, in our past so that we can think forward into the future, so that we kind of know where we're going and that we feel rooted in our own community. And when I thought about, are there stories of other people with disabilities in this tradition? I found many of them. Not only is our people descended from multiple people with disabilities, for example, Leah had a visual disability, as is indicated in Genesis 28, and where do we learn about the idea of reasonable accommodations? We learn about the idea of reasonable accommodations from the 4th chapter of the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot, in which God says to a very reluctant Moshe, I get it, you've got a speech impediment and you really don't want to take these people. I get it. However, I've got a reasonable accommodation for you. Aaron will speak for you. Done and done. And in the Babylonian Talmud, there are so many stories of sages with disabilities of all kinds, though they would not have used necessarily that language to describe themselves, who are actively part of their communities, and because they have deep and abiding relationships within their Batei Midrash, within their houses of study, they are able to make significant change through those reciprocal and mutual relationships that they have, which is a real key ingredient in terms of how we think about inclusion. For example, in Kedushin 31a, we have Rav Yosef, who is a Babylonian Amora, a Babylonian sage, and he's blind. And he keeps all of the commandments, all of the mitzvot. But he realizes he's got a bit of a problem on his hands because the halacha, the tradition, says that if you observe a mitzvah that you are not obligated to observe, you don't receive reward for that. And at that point, blind Jews did not have the same obligation to religious commandments as sighted Jews. So Rav Yosef's like, wait a second, how am I not, wait a minute, the halacha needs to be reversed. Wouldn't it be better if the halacha was reversed and if I was actually obligated? And from here, we learn that blind Jews, generally speaking, have the exact same religious obligation that our sighted counterparts do. And I think, as a nearly ordained rabbi, this is one of the most empowering passages in all of Talmud, because here we have Rav Yosef, who is in the Beit Midrash, who the Talmud records as having opinions on so many different issues, who has a unique and dynamic personality, and who clearly had so many relationships with his fellow sages, not as the inclusion sage, not as the person they brought in because it was the nice or the kind thing to do, but because he was an integral, indispensable part of that Beit Midrash, because he knew he stood at Sinai with everyone else, and he knew he had a chelek in Torah, like everyone else, and he knew that in order for that to be revealed and made manifest, this was a question he needed to ask. And because he was so situated within his community, the issues of inclusion could be thought about very differently. And on a similar note, we learn in Pesachim 116b, there's a passage about the Seder night. And there was a rabbi who said, blind people aren't obligated to say the Haggadah on Seder night, aren't obligated in Magid, in the telling of the story, which we all know is so central to the holiday of Pesach. But then we find out in the Gemara that Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshet, who was another blind Amora, or sage, both said Magid, both recited the Haggadah on Seder night. And because we know that they acted in that way, blind people now are equally obligated to say the Haggadah on Pesach, because I like to think Rav Sheshet and Rav Yosef, both of whom were steeped in the rabbinic project, realized on some level, I'm just as part of this tradition and I want to pass it down to the next generation as is our mandate on Pesach, and why should I not do so? And the law was changed, or the tradition was changed, not because anybody felt sorry for Rav Yosef or Rav Sheshet, but because they were integral parts of their community. And they had that relationship, and they were not seen as a them, they were seen as part of the us. In Chagigah 5b, there's a beautiful story involving two rabbis who travel to a city. And when they get there, they ask a local, is there a Torah scholar here? The local responds, yeah, there's a Torah scholar here, but he's blind. So one of the rabbis says to the other, you're a really important messenger of the Jewish people. It would be beneath your honor to go visit him. Why don't I go and you stay here? And without missing a beat, the other rabbi says, no, I'm coming with you. And at the end of their visit with this sage, they receive a tremendous bracha. And on their homeward journey, the rabbi who was originally advised to stay behind says to his colleague, had I followed your advice, had I assumed that because this rabbi was blind, that would either detract from his humanity or somehow detract from his learning, or perhaps I would be led to think that the learning was inferior or it was the nice thing to do, I would have missed out on this incredible bracha. I, along with many of my peers in the Jewish community who have disabilities, have experienced an entire spectrum of experiences around disability access in the Jewish community. And the question is often asked when I'm asked about inclusion work, which is one of the things that I do because I am a Jew, because I am so committed to the work of inclusion as a deeply religious act, not in spite of my Judaism, but because I am so grounded and rooted. Why is it that Jews with disabilities aren't in our spaces? But I don't think that's the question we should be asking. What we need to think about is what are the ways in which we are unintentionally othering people even as we are trying to include. And I would say that one of the things that we tend to do quite a bit of when we think about inclusion is we say, we need to include Jews with disabilities in the fabric of Jewish life because we are commanded in the Torah 36 times to welcome the stranger, for we were strangers in the land of Egypt. Except the problem here is that we are not strangers. Weren't we all at Sinai together? I often find myself in synagogue or in a Beit Midrash, and I'll have a Braille Siddur with me, or I'll have a Braille Masechet of Talmud. And somebody will come over to me and ask me about whether or not that's Hebrew, or say, wow, that's so cool, you can read that. And though those comments are coming from a well-intended place, and though I am fairly sure that I am the first Hebrew Braille reader that most people have met, they can often feel very othering because the underlying message, which is heard not only by folks who are blind like myself, but by many other Jews with disabilities, is that there's the one correct way to access information, and then there are these other ways that people access information that are different or other. But if we think again about the fact that we are all hosts in our tradition, and that we all stood at Sinai together to receive Torah, then we come to understand that the way that we access that revelation is different for some of us than it is for others of us, but that all ways of access are as valid as any other way of access. I am part of a community that has been around for about 4 decades at this point. And a couple of years ago, we decided collectively, we realized there are Jews with disabilities in this community. There always have been. But there are some ways in which some access needs that they have aren't being met. What can we do collectively, because we treasure all of our community members, to make the space maximally inclusive? And it became an all-hands-on-deck endeavor. Multi-year, very focused on the relationship building. And there were mistakes that were made along the way. And there are still mistakes made along the way. And all of us are learning, because no one is an expert on disability. We are all the individual experts on our own lives and experiences, which means that when we do this sacred work, we have to enter it with a great deal of anava, a great deal of humility, and deeply committed to helping folks who want to do Jewish as their full selves have that opportunity. So now our community has a section in our program that is about accessibility, and we talk about some of our access features like our ASL interpreters, or the fact that we provide electronic copies of all documents, and any number of things. And those are now so part of the fabric of that community that it's almost unremarkable, because we understand that some of us need other ways of access than others of us do, and together we are a stronger and more cohesive community. When we allow all to bring forward our Torah into the world, I believe we are living the mission that we as Jews are commanded to. We have to think, when we think about inclusion and we think about the ways in which our tradition offers us new paradigms for thinking about inclusion as very much about relationship building and very much about going from the ground up and treating every single person as the unique being that they are with so many multifaceted interests. We really are presented with an incredibly empowering model. And I think that the more that we root ourselves in that incredibly empowering model, the more we are going to be able to say with confidence and with deep wisdom and truth that we are all the us and there is no them. Thank you.